Hello everyone, Tom Slater here, editor of Spiked. We'll get into this very special end of year episode of the Spiked podcast in just one moment. But before we do that, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has donated to our Christmas appeal so far. It really means a lot. You know, Spiked is completely free. All of our articles and our videos and our podcasts are free to access. And yet still you hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that we can maintain our independence, our freedom and our fearlessness as we go into the next year. So thank you to everyone who has donated. And if you haven't donated yet, but you'd like to, please do go to spiked-online.com/donate to do so. We also have a special offer on at the moment. So if you donate £30 or more over the festive period, you'll get a whole year's access to Spiked supporters, which is our donor community where you can access exclusive events, our comment section, discounts on our books and merchandise, and much more. Once again, that's spiked-online.com/donate. Thank you very much. A very Merry Christmas. And now on with the show.
Hello and welcome to this extra special end of year edition of the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me in the studio as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
Also with us right here, we have the Spectator's Freddy Gray.
Hello.
And down the line, we're delighted to be joined by Spiked columnist Rakib, Ehsan.
Hello.
And Spiked columnist and stand-up comedian Simon Evans.
Morning.
So coming up on today's show, we'll be looking back at the biggest events of the year, essentially the war, the culture war, and the revolt against the laptop class. So Tom, I think it's fair to say the biggest event of the year in February was the war in Ukraine. Certainly turned the entire world upside down, challenged everyone's assumptions about, the future. Mm-hmm. And perhaps one of the most amazing things to draw out of this was the Ukrainian resistance. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Well, it is worth kind of casting your mind back because, as you say, the world has changed so utterly. You kind of forget what it was like in those early days. But there was a lot of speculation that Ukraine would fall almost overnight. I mean, even, General Milley in the US was suggesting Ukraine could essentially fall to Russia in about 72 hours. And yet it was another prediction which turned out to be wrong. And I think the thing that's been so telling in recent months is just the fact that all of the sort of lies about Ukraine, that it wasn't a proper nation, that it wouldn't be able to defend itself, that it wouldn't want to defend itself, were just completely laying out for the lies that they were. And it's been really quite striking how this particular conflict, I guess, has shaken not just the kind of geopolitical order, but I guess the West in particular. We had been given to these sorts of fantasies that it was the end of history, that conflict, at least for Europe and the West, was kind of a thing of the past. It was something that happened over there. It was something that was kind of arm's length, that you didn't have to worry about kind of that bigger political instability. You didn't have to worry about keeping the lights on. Like the only fights left to have were over, who could go in whose toilet and so on. All of that has changed now fundamentally. And the positive, if there is a positive to extract from this, is again the kind of stunning bravery of people on the ground in Ukraine who have shocked the world and Russia in their ability to resist this imperialistic invasion.
Yeah, and you're right. It's certainly the bravery of the Ukrainians has exposed the kind of uselessness of our own elites, not just the geopolitical complacency, but the energy complacency. They even seem to think that inflation would never come back and things like that. That seems to, have really left them looking terrible. They're not the adults in the room that they made out to be. Freddie, I just want to come to you for a sec to talk about how people have responded politically to the war in Ukraine. Because it's fair to say that probably 90% of people, or the vast majority of people, are, very much in favour of supporting Ukraine. But there are some, on the left, it's as if the anti-war types are not particularly concerned about a war if it's waged by Russia. On the right, there are these kind of sovereignist types who are not that bothered by this violent incursion of Vladimir Putin into Ukrainian sovereignty. What do you think? What do you make of that? What's that all about?
Well, I suppose I come from the sort of the anti-war right, and we kind of conditioned ourselves since Iraq to think that the war hawks in Washington are wrong about the DC foreign policy establishment, if you like, are wrong about everything.
And they usually are.
But for once, they sort of got it right. I mean, they said the invasion was going to happen. I kept thinking, it can't actually happen. Putin's not that stupid. And then turns out he was. And not only was he stupid, his military he vastly underestimated the competence of his own military and, of course, the strength of Ukrainian nationalism. So I think really there is some sort of perverse kind of alt-right talk in America, and particularly about kind of that the Ukrainians are just sort of LARPing at nationalism. There is a real war going on. Yeah. They are actually dying. They are putting up a heroic. In fact, I was so surprised by it that I booked a flight to Poland actually, and then went in to go and see what was going on because I couldn't really understand it. I only got to Lviv. It wasn't at all heroic. I was miles away from any conflict. I didn't hear a single shot. I just wanted to hear one shot so I could say I was in a war zone, but I wasn't. But I did, it was sort of all the boring things that every journalist in the world has said. It was pretty inspiring to see a country mobilize itself, and that Putin's trying to impose a sort of 19th century vision of the world on a 20th, 21st century country.
And Simon, I think it's fair to say that even a real war couldn't quash the culture war, and there were kind of elements of the culture war that bled into this. I don't know, people might remember quite in the early days of the war, all these prodigy pianists being cancelled, or film festivals being banned, or even Tchaikovsky was no longer performed at one stage. Apparently it was all his fault. I mean, what have you made of that sort of irrepressible? The sort of irrepressibleness of the culture war, that even something like this couldn't put a break on it.
Well, I suppose I might say, was it the culture war, or was it simply alignment with good causes and the familiar temptations for virtue signalling? I don't know whether I'd call it culture war exactly, but certainly people who worked within what you might call the cultural sector wanted to demonstrate their support for the right side. And one of the aspects, I suppose, of the culture war in the last few years is an extraordinary amount of predictable alignments, so that you can guess if somebody is anti-vax, where they stand on American politics generally, or whether they believe that America was trying to provoke Russia into attacking Ukraine. Those kind of things seem to fall into an alignment which it wouldn't be easy to express in obvious, coherent, logical forms. So yes, there were some strange outbreaks, but I suppose, if I'm to be generous, I think it is understandable that people want to demonstrate that they have, no time at all for wars of aggression on the borders of Europe, a little bit further away, and we might feel slightly more ambivalent about them, or be able to look the other way. And people do feel weirdly helpless. Living in Brighton, I know a lot of families who sort of rushed immediately to try and secure themselves a Ukrainian refugee or something that they could demonstrate their commitment to the cause with. And quite a lot of those families have found that things are more complicated than that. So I have a tiny bit of sympathy with people who just wanted to demonstrate whatever they could to the Ukrainian people. And who knows, it is possible, I suppose, to play devil's advocate for a moment, it is possible that part of the borderline miraculous steadfastness shown by the Ukrainian people from the top down was to some extent bolstered by the obvious, unambiguous commitment made within this country and across Europe to their cause.
That makes sense to me. Let's move on to fully focus on the culture war. Over this year, I think it's fair to say that what has become known as Turf Island, Britain, the home of gender-critical feminists, have secured some quite surprising and stunning victories. We've had the closure of the Tavistock clinic, or the announcement that it will be closed. We've had the interim caste review, laying into the kind of affirmative model of gender-affirming care. We've had various court cases where feminists have been found, on the right side. They've been discriminated against for their gender-critical views. Rakib, do you think we're kind of turning the tide on this particular issue, that maybe some reason is kind of coming back into the discussion?
Well, there have been some controversial movements on the gender self-identification front north of the border, so I wouldn't quite say that the tide has completely turned. But there is a cultural pushback, which I am pleased to see. I thought it was really interesting that we saw a rather large list of MPs condemning Jeremy Clarkson's piece in The Sun on Meghan Markle, saying that this could potentially contribute towards violence and intimidation towards women and girls. And looking at the list of MPs, there's parliamentarians there who are also perfectly comfortable with undermining the integrity of female-only sensitive spaces through their positions on gender self-identification. So I do think that the tide is somewhat turned. As you said, Fraser, talked about the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. But I wouldn't say that the job is completely done. And that's largely because we still have an uncomfortable number of MPs who are more than happy to sacrifice women's rights on the altar of radical transgenderism.
Simon, do you think that this the trans movement has become a bit more exposed this year? I remember, you wrote a really funny piece about one of the trans activists screaming at a baby, or at least screaming at a father holding a child.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? How it's like the great sleeping giant of the British public have finally started to wake up to what's going on. I think certainly earlier this year, I remember talking to various mums, for instance, from the school, who were completely oblivious to what was going on in everything from women's swimming to women's refuges in this case. That they had that default attitude, which the British have, I think, and to their credit, and in particular, which women have, which is a sense of fairness, of wanting people who are struggling in one way or another to have the best opportunities they can, to work their lives out, to live their life as they see fit. And they had not registered just quite how extreme and how extraordinary and how challenging, I think, not just to women's rights, but to our fundamental grasp of reality, to our ability to remain sane. I don't entirely endorse the idea that we frame this argument in terms of women's rights. I think we should put it on even more fundamental solid ground than that, and say this is, part of the Western philosophical tradition is that, it's built on logos, the idea that we use words to describe the universe, that we can all agree on what that means, and that, that's how we build reality for ourselves. And without compare, the trans issue has been the greatest challenge to that I've ever seen in my lifetime. There's been nothing ever like it. All the previous sort of aspects of the culture war were genuinely up for debate, whether or not, I don't know, you should have a black actor playing Macbeth, or whether or not, boys should be allowed to choose different styles of clothing. All those, I don't know, there's like loads of things that are totally up for debate and just show how society is transforming and evolving at all points. But the trans thing is just, I think, when a huge number of people have finally clocked just how insane it is. And I don't know whether that means the tide is turning, but I do certainly think that far more people now are engaged with the argument, and that can only be a good thing, because that is, that basically shortens the odds that reality, truth, and reason will win out.
Well, I would just add that I think, you're absolutely right that the reality's had some good wins. I think the extremists are getting more extreme, and that's the danger. And I don't think trans terrorism is beyond our imaginations or reality even. I mean, Spectator had a very large bloke called Phoebe who he did a video. He went down to this. He put a knife to his eye.
Yeah.
And said, I'm going to do to the Spectator what they did to Charlie Hebdo. And the first thing we knew about it was she'd been sent down. But we wanted to campaign to say, because we're so free speech, Phoebe should be allowed to do that video.
Yeah.
That's what Nicola Sturgeon's latest fan, by the sound. We probably should talk about Scotland briefly.
Let's talk about it briefly, because it's kind of breaking news as this podcast has been recorded.
I mean, it will probably change by the time people get to hear this in about a day's time or so. But you have had the gender recognition reforms pass in Holyrood. Since then, obviously, Westminster suggesting that they might block it because it essentially puts Scotland on a collision course with the rest of the UK on questions of gender recognition and the equality law and so on. But it is really striking how Nicola Sturgeon has been pursuing this agenda, even though the very clear will of the Scottish public is against all of the key reforms, whether that's making it, you only have to live in your new acquired gender for 3 months rather than 2 years. 16 and 17-year-olds can transition. They even blocked an amendment last night that would stop sex offenders deciding to kind of essentially transition in the process of a trial, and therefore potentially not only be referred to as the opposite sex by potentially the complainant in a trial, but also to access women's prisons. All of this in the very clear opposition to the Scottish public. So like all those debates we had about what would an independent Scotland really look like, you want to kind of be half in the UK, half in the EU. What's really going to be that different apart from, you want to be under the thumb of Brussels rather than the UK. Apparently it's allowing sex offenders to be women is the clear answer.
It's the great civil rights movement of our time, as you well know. Right, we've got to move on to race through this year. Of course, one of the biggest moments was the passing of the Queen, and that seems to have been almost usurped by the rise of the ghastly Meghan and Harry. It's almost as if they represent two different types of attitudes, two different ways of approaching the world. And, there's some relevance to this truth discussion as well that we've been having. I mean, Freddie, what have you made of the, let's start with the Meghan and Harry first.
Because you were having a go at Meghan and Harry before it was cool as well.
I was doing way before it was cool. Yeah. I was
very early on. You were concerned
way before MPs would write letters calling for you to.
No, I think. I mean, there's this sort of argument that you hear quite a lot that Harry and Meghan, while the Brits may get their back up and we don't like our country being criticised and the tabloids are all against her, that actually what they're doing is very clever. And they're appealing to everyone in America because America is insanely woke, et cetera, et cetera. That's just rubbish.
Yeah.
It's just not true. I mean, most Americans don't think about the monarchy at all. In as much as they do, they find it funny and ridiculous. If Harry and Meghan can add to the hilarity, then all the better.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole thing about the Harry and Meghan show. I'd guess 90% of the audience are watching it hoping to laugh. And they do laugh a bit and then they get very bored.
Yeah.
That's certainly what I did. And I think most Americans I've spoken to about it feel the same way.
It's not funny for 6 hours, is it?
It's not funny for 6 hours. But this idea that they're sort of betting on the right side of history, I think is dumb and counter to reality.
Yeah, Tom, do you want to say something a bit about that? The Sussexes positioning themselves as the right side of history, particularly in contrast to the late Queen.
Yes, I mean, I suppose what you see is because they've tried to kind of play this game is to say, we're against the institution, we're not against the Queen, but they are against everything that the Queen essentially stood for.
Yeah,
and especially in the midst of the public mourning and so on, you did see people kind of rediscover a lot of that language around service and stoicism and so on. All these things which are now really out of fashion. It's not really about public service; it's about self-care. It's not really about nationhood. It's about victimhood and so on. Like they do represent that clear shift. And I think whilst at the same time, I think there is a point at which even their kind of former cheerleaders are starting to recognise that they backed a couple of chances in some cases. People are kind of slowly backing away from the crime scene a little bit now. I think the problem is that they do in their very naff hallmark card way represent the kind of elite zeitgeist, if you like. So, and that kind of shift from an older establishment which for all its flaws at least wasn't as emotionally incontinent and identitarian as the new one. Harry and Meghan are definitely that kind of new generation coming through, it feels like.
I read a piece recently that came through online about a philosopher I'm very interested in called René Girard, who is dead now, but he wrote in a book called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, and it was talking about the rise of victim culture. He said that there is one overriding value which dominates the total planetary culture in which we live, far more so than technological progress or economic growth. It is a concern for victims and the consequent rise of victim power. And I think you have to understand that and integrate that into your concept of what's going on in the world to understand how Harry and Meghan are playing the game, because that's something that would have been completely alien to every single previous generation of the royal family. The idea that they would play victims to the world with their absurd, almost like surreal level of wealth, privilege and power and luxury. But they've somehow turned that. And that is the key to understanding what they've grasped and what so far the royal family has yet to do so, I think.
So I want to move on to talk about free speech, but there is a kind of Meghan theme to start this off. Just recently, Jeremy Clarkson has been, I think it's fair to say, paraded naked through the metaphorical streets and had excrement thrown at him.
To be fair, he is a farmer now. He's probably covered in shit half the time anyway, isn't
it? But I wonder, because Rakib, you touched on the Clarkson stuff there. What have you made of this particular circus?
Well, I mean, I think Jeremy Clarkson is hopeless at the best of times, and he has form on this front. It was a terrible piece, but I just think the political reaction to the piece published in The Sun, it's been so melodramatic. It's incredible. You have MPs who are supposedly concerned over women's safety. They're of the view that this piece written by Clarkson might incite violence and intimidation towards women and girls. Very interestingly, these very politicians don't have a single word to say about the grooming gangs crisis which has taken hold in Britain. I'll call it glamour feminism. They're obsessed with Meghan Markle, but when it comes to those bread and butter issues of domestic violence and issues such as group-based child sexual abuse, which primarily affects vulnerable working class girls, they're nowhere to be seen.
Definitely. And so obviously the Clarkson thing has been the most recent kind of free speech flashpoint in our memories. But, this has been a year of extraordinary big tech censorship, and I suppose of some loosening of big tech censorship with the rise of Elon Musk and his takeover of Twitter.
It's definitely a game of two halves.
It is.
Because you almost forget because of all the excitement around Elon Musk.
Yeah, so Tom, do you want to take us through some of the things that happened earlier on in the year?
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
That's really,
Because everyone does kind of forget what was happening in February with the truckers and so on, which felt like the beginning of, or at least the hardening of big tech censorship, the reaching of it into more areas of life. Like they could deplatform you, but now they could defund you. So you had GoFundMe, the fundraising platform, deprive the Freedom Convoy, as it was called, against vaccine mandates and so on in Ottawa and elsewhere, of being able to access the money that they themselves had fundraised. Kind of, again, working almost in concert with the Canadian government, which was freezing bank accounts and, extending their terrorist financing laws to affect these truckers who had just turned up, blocked some roads and said, we don't want to go along with these policies. So you had that kind of really frightening extension. We saw, of course, reach into the UK with the PayPal scandals, where you saw groups like the Free Speech Union and Us for Them, and particularly kind of lockdown skeptical organisations, essentially being deprived of their accounts and, by connection, essentially blocking off a significant way in which people would donate to them. I think it was a third of the Free Speech Union's funds were drawn from PayPal accounts on what was quite clearly political grounds. They'd referenced loosely hate speech policies and so on. So the ability of big tech to kind of unperson someone or an organisation was demonstrated with sort of terrifying detail, if you like. But I suppose since then the story has been all about Elon Musk, and I'm sure we'll get more into that. But I think the one thing that's been striking about the response to that, the kind of shock and horror that he has been liberalising things on Twitter to some degree, is that you clearly see that the cultural elite, the liberal left, whatever you want to call them, for all of their naysaying in recent years, they do recognise how powerful a weapon this was and how they were kind of in control of it. And I think that a lot of the hysteria around Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter has sort of demonstrated that in many respects.
And Freddy, one of the most interesting things that Elon Musk has done since his takeover is the so-called Twitter files, releasing these internal documents showing the extent of big tech censorship, so showing the extent of collaboration with the security services and the Democratic Party and things like that. Yeah. Do you want to say a bit about that?
I thought that it's been extremely funny just to watch it and a bit terrifying.
Yeah.
But I thought the most terrifying, so the first lot of Twitter files were done by a journalist called Matt Taibbi, who's a very good journalist. And they were not disappointing. They were sort of interesting to a certain extent, but they were a bit of a damp squib. They kind of, you sort of thought, oh, well, we knew this happened.
Yeah.
And you thought, okay, well, we're not getting much here. And then a few days later, there was this supplemental Twitter files where we found out that the files had been vetted by a former general counsel at the FBI, who's now the senior deputy counsel at Twitter. And they'd been, a lot of files had actually been scrubbed. So you realize, you just see quite how hand in glove American intelligence, deep state, if you want to use that word, were with big tech. And the terrifying thing about the response to Musk, for me, is we like to think that there's sort of, the elite and everybody, if they realize what was going on, they'd be outraged. Yeah. But what you actually see is everybody's outrage at Musk for revealing it. Because it ruined Twitter for a lot of dickheads, and it's like deeply depressing.
It's either this is a nothing burger, we knew that anyway.
Yeah, that's the best thing.
Why is he doing this? He's going to spread hate. Simon, what do you make about Musk as a kind of countercultural figure? I mean, he's sort of popped up in actually all of the topics that we've spoken about already. I mean, he's part of the free speech discussion. He was giving sort of Starlink, internet to Ukraine. He
turn on that issue, it's fair to say.
He's
been red-pilled on many fronts.
Yeah, that's true. But he's also he's a part of the culture wars as well. I mean, what do you make of him as a figure?
Yeah, he's a very interesting figure. He's a bit of a shapeshifter, isn't he? Some of his previous eruptions into public consciousness have been a good deal less heroic than his present mode, like calling the cave divers in Thailand paedophiles because they use his submarine or something. I mean, he's an extraordinary character. That people have put up quite detailed accounts of how he has, to some extent, not exactly risen without trace, but perhaps not been quite as responsible for quite as many of the sort of technological innovations or indeed the sort of great business gambles that you might assume, given that he's become the world's wealthiest man. He's one of those people who's sort of swum with the tide a little bit more than you might think. I've been quite impressed with his openness to the possibility that no possible reform is off the books. That there is nothing he won't consider and play with. You do sometimes feel as if he's reinventing the wheel to an unnecessary extent with Twitter. But I think a lot of people did feel that, the kind of demons that were flushed out of the main building and seen wandering away with their cardboard boxes in their hands was quite an extraordinary exposure. That was a couple of days for the ages. And some of the sort of interviews carried out by the Huffington Post and what have you afterwards with people who were in charge of, human rights within the building and so on, were, exposed to. I agree with you to some extent, Fred, that there was a little bit of a damp squib anticlimax when the Twitter files came out, but I think a lot of all of that was to do with the fact that we'd already seen the kind of people who were working there already, and we'd already had our worst suspicions confirmed by that point. I still have faith that he might. This time next year, I think we might have a better, stronger, more coherent, responsible Twitter than we have previously. And I think the main takeaway I've had so far from his ownership of it is that a huge number of the left wing, the journalists, the commentariat who had become quite complacent in their assumption that they were basically running the show and it was aligned with their beliefs and their sentiments and so on, were absolutely horrified with what they thought might emerge under Musk's rule, and I just don't think we've seen that. I don't know what experience other people have had. Possibly they have been trolled more than you would think, but honestly, my experience of Twitter has hardly changed at all. A lot of the old accounts that I followed, who were cancelled one after another since the early 2010s, some of them I was really looking forward to coming back, but they haven't, sadly. Some of the more provocative and risky ones. I just don't think it's. I don't think you can ever quite reclaim the pre-Trump. What people were hoping for was that kind of the Kekistan, the frog era, previous to Donald Trump's election, when people were peppering Twitter with really quite outrageous provocations. We haven't seen a return to that. And actually, I think on the whole, the fact that it is a bit of a damp squib in that regard is probably a good thing. It means there's not going to be an eruption. And I don't want to see all the left-leaning journalists having to migrate to Mastodon or whatever it's called. I think it would be a shame if we lost the town square element of this. That's the one thing we want to restore it to.
Although I do think migrating to Mastodon is a bit like when everyone says they're going to move to Canada if the Republican wins or something like that.
It is interesting, though. I know we've got plenty more to cover, but how as soon as Elon Musk takes over, all of the arguments that were always made as to why big tech censorship was fine just completely evaporate. I mean, not least because there has been some questionable cases of him kicking off certain accounts for allegedly doxing him, which is a whole can of worms we don't really need to get into. But it was interesting that around that whole point, all of the arguments that it's a private company, they can do what they want, and it's just like being banned from your local bar. It doesn't affect how you can act, well, what are you complaining about? All of that has completely evaporated now, which is good in a sense because it has you would hope that it has confronted both sides with the reality that just having a billionaire or a handful of billionaires having just kind of executive autocratic control over a big sphere in which political debate takes place is probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
But as we all know, they'll revert back to type as soon as someone else buys it out.
Can I also just very quickly add that I think we had the best tweet of all time from Musk, which was my pronouns are prosecute Fauci. I just love that. You just read it over and over again.
So we should move on to talk briefly about an even more terrifying form of censorship. People, I think, have probably quite easily and understandably forgotten that this was the year that Salman Rushdie was brutally stabbed. A crazed Islamist finally tried to act out on the fatwa that was passed after his Satanic Verses was released. Rakib, what do you make of this incident?
Well, an absolutely tragic incident, but also I thought what was tragic was the lack of political condemnation. You even had some politicians in the British context suggest that not that he had it coming, but that we need to be careful in terms of how we talk about organized religion, that some of the material that's been written in the past by Sir Salman Rushdie is Islamophobic, all too often used to clamp down on very important debates. I felt that the incident also I think what it demonstrated was that the diverse nature of Islamist terrorism. To my understanding, the perpetrator expressed sympathies with Islamic Republic of Iran, belonged to the Shia denomination. So I think it shed a very different light, because the one of the dominant strands of Islamist extremism in the Western context is Salafist jihadism, while here you had the Shia extremist threat on show. So I think, just from my counterterrorism background, I think that the important thing that attack did highlight is the diverse nature within the broader Islamist terror threat in the Western world.
Tom, do you want to say something to Salman Rushdie? I'm still struck just by the fact that how quickly it faded from memory. You know, as soon as almost as soon as you knew he was on life support rather than had been killed, it kind of fell off the front pages.
Well, of course, the story of the Rushdie affair is, of course, of Islamist extremist censorship and this barbaric talk of murdering people because they wrote a book that upset you. But it's always been also of the liberal cowardice.
Yeah.
And I think and it's always worth remembering, obviously, back when the fatwa was first issued, that kind of cowardice you saw across the political class. People don't remember that even the Thatcher government were very sheepish about this particular issue, you know, choosing to condemn the book and the author, whilst also saying that obviously it's not okay that you're calling for people to assassinate him. But if you think about what's happened when they finally got to him, and there wasn't even that kind of brief post-Charlie Hebdo, Je suis Charlie type moment. Yeah. Everyone was just shocked. It was like, oh, that's a terrible thing that's happened. The broader significance of it seemed to be lost on people. And so we could talk about what happened from when the fatwa was first introduced to now. And as I say, there was a lot of kind of a cowardice in coming forward even then. But if you even think from 2015 and the attack on Charlie Hebdo and today and this year, again, people just really struggling to find the minerals to say it's out of order to try to kill someone because they wrote a novel. Yeah. It really should rattle us, I think. And the fact that most people don't even know really what state he's in still. We've only really had bits and bobs of information come out via his publicist and so on. The lack of sustained journalistic and political interest shames us, I think, in so many different respects. But I can't say I was that surprised by it, I guess.
Simon, I wanted to talk to you a bit about another sort of provocative area of speech, if you can call it that, comedy, because it's been a dark year for comedians. Even the great and knowingly offensive Jerry Sadowitz was cancelled. We had the famous slap of Chris Rock by Will Smith for his jokes. We had people assault Dave Chappelle on stage for his jokes about trans people. I mean, is comedy getting dangerous as well?
I mean, you can certainly pick up a trend if you're inclined to. I suppose when you drill down into them, each one of those incidents probably had a mix of, you know, multivariate cause or whatever. And I don't necessarily think that they all reflect a general drift in the culture. Jerry Sadowitz, I think, as much as anything else, was a victim of something I encountered a little bit the year previously as well, which comes very specifically from the Edinburgh Festival's human resources struggles and challenges, possibly caused by Brexit. You never know. But the fundamental problem the Edinburgh Festival has is that it relies heavily on young, rather brittle students to work front of house and as ushers and so on. And they're not representative of the sort of people who actually go to the shows in Edinburgh to enjoy themselves. And very often a sort of little wildfire can rush through them, and they get into a panic over something they've heard and half understood and not really grasped the context of. And they are not previously confronted Jerry Sadowitz. They don't know that he has a habit of waggling a prosthetic penis into the faces of the front row, or that when he calls Rishi Sunak a racial slur, then he's doing that in character as though he were a member of the Tory grandee membership and that sort of thing. And they don't grasp it. And because the venues rely so heavily on this kind of itinerant labour not to close down for the month that they're there, they can be held hostage, which is an absolute tragedy and a catastrophe. But it is still quite a narrow demographic. Unfortunately, one of the big facts that everyone has learned in the last few years is this 3.5% thing, you know, that you only need a tiny number of borderline insane activists and they can swing huge amounts of change, in their chosen field of activity. And that's what you saw there. So I think Sadovitz will live to ride another day, but theatres should make sure that not only are warnings issued to the punters, they should be issued to the staff as well, to understand that if you're going to come and work on a Sadovitz show, you will encounter some good old-fashioned vulgarity. All of these other things, these specific incidents, the Chris Rock thing was absolutely shocking, really, really terrible. And I thought he handled it incredibly well. And also, to his credit, didn't then try and write an entire hour-and-a-half show about the PTSD that he's suffered ever since as well. Other comedians take note. But, you compare that to getting hit by a bread roll at a charity lunch. I think you can sort of understand what it is possible to encounter on stage and maintain your dignity. But I think, again, Will Smith is not really, he's not a representative of some drifting culture. This is often the way. When you see certain events, you think, oh my God, it's an example of this, that, or the other. But actually, if you drill down into them a little bit, I do think, comedy is possibly losing its appetite for offence. And we have got to a position, as I say, where activists are capable of having a chilling effect, and we have to resist it. But nevertheless, I think it still potentially has the cojones to come through.
So let's move on to talk about the kind of broader political trends. It's been a whirlwind year in UK politics. We've had the demise, or some people call it the ousting, of Boris Johnson, kind of precipitated and almost cheered on by a kind of media class. We had the brief Liz Truss interim for 44 days, extraordinary period. And now we have Rishi Sunak, and it feels like this kind of almost technocratic kind of politics is creeping back against what I would say are the wishes of the people. Tom, are we sort of back where we were in 2010 or something now?
No, because the world has changed. I think voters have changed. I think all this kind of idea about populism is dead, or that kind of brief experiment people had with wanting politicians to actually do what they say they want and to actually align somewhat with their wishes and interests is over. That everyone's just realised that was obviously a mistake. It's obviously nonsense. But you can't help but feel that, particularly if you put Sunak and Starmer across each other at the respective dispatch boxes, you do feel like we're back in that kind of competing flavours of blancmange,
Yeah.
It's just that kind of deathly, quite technocratic sort of situation. And it's being talked up in precisely those terms. We've dispatched Boris Johnson, this kind of virus which got inside the body politic, and that had to be expelled. And now we can get back to normal. But even though it's quite clear that the way things are going, yes, the Conservative Party has collapsed, but that's probably just going to deliver a Labour government against all odds, or at least it felt like that not too long ago. I think the conditions that created the sort of 2016, essentially, really haven't gone away. And I think anyone just hoping that everything's going to get back to normal, as they would say it, are just, it's a wing and a prayer, really, because again, that sort of restive spirit, you might not see it in the UK at the moment. I think a lot of those voters who moved from Labour to the Conservatives, they haven't gone back.
Yeah.
A lot of them just probably won't vote at the next election, is the sort of sense that you get from the polling and so on. But the fact that you look around the world and you see that it clearly hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
And I think it clearly hasn't gone away in the UK either. We're just in another kind of interregnum at the moment, I suppose.
Freddie, let's talk a bit about America. And Trump has obviously been the kind of the obvious figurehead for the sort of populist movement in the States. But he's lost a bit of his touch this year, or people are turning their backs on him, I think it's fair to say.
I think so. I think in America and in Britain, voters are being sort of quickly disabused of the notion that if they make it clear that they want things to happen through the ballot, they won't happen. So I think sort of people are giving up on Trump because obviously he's a ridiculous figure. Trumpism is in a very strange state. My personal view is I still think he'll win the nomination, but I'm increasingly in the minority there.
Yeah.
And I think that the Republican Party is, well, if you look at something like Ukraine, the Republican Party is hopelessly split. And the establishment knows what it thinks. There's a very clear bipartisan agreement, but Republican voters are not comfortable with it. So I think the right is shattering in America just as it's shattering in Britain. I mean, it's been a terrible year for the Tory party.
And Rakib, in Europe, there has been something of a kind of populist revival. Particularly, I'm thinking of Brothers of Italy in Italy, and the rise of the Sweden Democrats. I mean, how do you account for that? And what do you think it means?
Well, I think in Sweden, there's very serious problems surrounding the social and economic integration of newly arrived migrants and refugees. And I think that has fed into increasing levels of right-wing populist support. I think in Italy there is that sort of right of centre Euroscepticism, which has existed in the country for some time, but that's also being mixed with economic protectionism. So you can see Brothers of Italy adopting that kind of Eurosceptic, culturally and economically protectionist agenda, and it's worked for them very well in an electoral sense. I'll just follow up on some of the points that Freddy made. I think that transatlantic conservatism, you could say, is going through a bit of a crisis. I think the Republicans would really do well to just get away from Donald Trump as much as possible. Maybe back in the day he was an electoral asset. The recent midterm results suggest otherwise. A lot has changed. While here in Britain, if truth be told, the Conservative Party, I don't really know what they've achieved in government over the last 12 years. And the Truss government was one of the most disastrous political experiments imaginable. Almost combining everything that Brexit wasn't about. Many pro-Brexit voters are quite protectionist in their policy preferences. There was one point in the Truss government, I think the Prime Minister Truss was of the view that the best way to engineer economic growth was through industrial scale immigration, which I think pretty much goes against what the average pro-Brexit voter that would have voted for the Conservatives back in the 2019 general election would have believed in. So you could say that in both Britain and the United States, there is a bit of a crisis in conservatism, but you can see in other parts of Europe, right-wing populism, there is somewhat of a re-emergence.
Simon, I mean, what do you make of this kind of idea that, you know, are the adults kind of putting a lid back on things? What's your take, just briefly?
I do have a sense that Sunak is much more comfortable in the company of people like Trudeau and Macron than any Prime Minister of Britain has had for a very long time. He seems, without drifting into conspiracy theory stuff, he does seem much more comfortable with the whole World Economic Forum type agenda. I don't know how popular that's going to be with British voters or Conservative voters when the time comes. But there is no doubt at all that they've taken a huge gamble, essentially, on the economy turning around in the next 12 months. And if it turns around, however, from a very low base, and we are experiencing real pain now of a kind that, you know, you have to go back to days of 4 television channels to remember what it was like the last time there was this kind of price escalation and strikes and a genuine kind of winter of discontent kind of mode. In fact, 3 television channels. If they can come up from that base, if there is a bounce in 12 months' time, in time for the general election, insane though it might be, you just never know. They might get away with it, and people might feel, okay, he has demonstrated that he needed to take some painful actions. You know, people have very short memories, and they might just turn around. But my suspicion is that the Tories have now had their Norman Lamont singing in the shower moment, and they're not going to recover from this.
And Tom, finally, I mean, it's worth thinking about that, you know, the sort of pushback doesn't necessarily have to come from within the political system. And this has been a great year of all of these movements, suddenly some springing out of nowhere. I'm thinking about the truckers or the various farmers in Europe, particularly in Holland. Even in Sri Lanka, the kind of revolt against the organic movement there, you know, people rejecting the kind of orthodoxies of the laptop class quite forcefully.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think when we talk about populism, there is a tendency quite naturally to talk about the hopes of particular right-wing parties, populist parties, left populist parties, whatever, and that when they rise or fall, populism is alive or it's dead, you know. And yet what I think has been so striking is that in the kind of post-2016 period is that you just see it popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
So you saw it in France, you know, Emmanuel Macron is voted in and suddenly everyone breathes a sigh of relief in 2017. You know, populism is vanquished because this centrist former banker is in charge. They almost instantly have the Gilets jaunes protest that kind of springs up. As you were saying, the truckers protest, you know, you take a leader like Trudeau, if anyone sums up the kind of technocratic, liberal sort of, ongoing regime, it's him. And yet again, you see this incredible kind of affront to his authority, which he then has to crack down on very severely in order to try and maintain face. And it's easy to forget that Brexit existed almost entirely outside of the main party political structure. There was the only party in Parliament at the time that supported it was DUP. This was a revolt from the bottom. And I think one thing that we've seen in whether it's in Canada, or whether it's in Holland, or whether it's elsewhere across the world is not only do you see new parties kind of rising and falling, because there's always that search for that new outlet for people to take voters seriously, been ignored for so long, but often they'll take matters into their own hands if that outlet isn't available either. And I think that's something that has been genuinely inspiring amidst this year, even while some pretty bad things have been going on in the world as well.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.